to make a 6-minute rebuttal at the lectern.
Thank you, Zakir. Kept me busy there, making notes. Let's start off by, as I said, I expected Zakir's main line of attack there was to undermine the credibility of the New Testament. I'm not sure we heard reasons why we should believe that the Quran is a revelation from God, but we heard a lot about why we shouldn't trust the New Testament. Now, Zakir mentioned the infancy gospel, and he suggested that maybe it was an actual historical source about Jesus speaking in the cradle. But that was written in the 5th or 6th century. But even if it is, even if that Arabic infancy gospel does reflect some genuine report about Jesus speaking from the cradle, how do you account for the content of it being completely Islamized? I think there's just as much of a problem. If I was a Muslim, I would rather not believe that it was a report from them. Now, Zakir said about the Quran being in a different language. I obviously didn't use that as an argument, the fact that the Quran is in Arabic. Now, Zakir made the point about prophecy, suggesting that the Bible prophesies Muhammad. Now, the reason Muslims believe that the Bible prophesies Muhammad is that the Quran says the Bible prophesies Muhammad. So if you're a Muslim, you have to find things in the Bible that prophesy Muhammad, otherwise the Quran is incorrect. So Muslims go to the Bible, I've been through it in a fine-tooth comb just to find any slither of a verse that could be taken to be prophesying Muhammad. I'm sure if any of you have ever read through Deuteronomy, you weren't struck by a verse that you thought that must be referring to Muhammad. The prophecy that Zakir spoke to was about a countryman. Now, the word countryman clearly means, in that context, a fellow Israelite. In the book of Acts, Peter applies that very prophecy to Jesus. The parallel stated with that prophecy is the one stated, someone who would speak God's words. Jesus did indeed speak God's words. At the time that prophecy was given, there weren't actually other prophets to refer to apart from Moses. Now again, Zakir went on to suggest that some other statements about the Holy Spirit are actually about Muhammad as well. The heart of that is the word for the Holy Spirit in Greece, helper, parakletos. Some Muslims claim that that's a mistake. It should really say paraklutos, which means honored or exalted one, which they take could have meant Muhammad. There's not a shred of documentary evidence that that was ever the word that was intended, but a lot of Muslims suggest that that's what it must have really meant. There are other verses as well that Muslims take to suggest that Muhammad is prophesied in the Bible. Now, Zakir said that the church at various points has had arguments about the status of Jesus. Was Jesus man or God or whatever? There were indeed controversies later on, but as I said, the New Testament documents are unanimous, and the early Christians were unanimous in their view on that. There have been debates and councils and arguments about Tawhid in Islam, the most fundamental doctrine of Islam, the oneness of God. There have been disputes about it within Islam. Now, Zakir quoted Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman's a very famous scholar, very skeptical, attacks Orthodox Christian faith, particularly in America. He was on the television a lot, writing books about it. And he said that Bart Ehrman claims that the church was divided between Gentiles and Jews in its early days, and this dispute about the status of Jesus. That's just absolutely untrue. There were controversies in the early church, and we've got records of them. You can read about some of them in the New Testament. You can read some in Galatians chapter 2. You can read some in Acts chapter 15. But it tells you what these disputes were about. They were about circumcision, the place of the Jewish law for Gentile converts, the role of women in the church. To suggest that those disputes were about the divinity of Jesus, there's no evidence at all that that was a contentious issue in the very earliest church. Now, Zakir accused the New Testament of exaggeration. He started off by saying the Gospel of Mark was written first. It may well have been. I don't think there's conclusive evidence of that. Some of the very earliest Christians said that they thought Matthew was written first, but Mark may well have been written first. Zakir then said Matthew and Luke copied Mark. I don't think there's evidence to suggest that is what happened. If these stories were circulating in oral form, they would circulate in slightly different versions. So one writer might take one version that he'd heard, and record that one. Another writer could take another version. But in Mark and Matthew and Luke, sometimes the same story is recounted with quite different wording, which rather undermines the copying hypothesis. Okay. Moving to Zacchaeus' attacks on things to do with the New Testament, about things that have changed. How significant did you think those changes were? Jesus could not perform more miracles. Jesus did not. Call me good, ask me about what is good. Who touched me? The other reports didn't say Jesus didn't say he touched me. Who touched me? It just doesn't record it. Maybe that report just didn't include that. It included other things instead. But there is an example of a case where the report in Mark is more impressive and sounds more miraculous than it does in, for example, Matthew or Luke. When Jesus heals a boy with an evil spirit, in Mark it says people were saying he's dead, and he takes him by the hand and he rises up. In Matthew and Luke, it doesn't sound that impressive. It just says he was ill, convulsing, whatever, and he was cured. So much less dramatic. So it's not the case that things get more and more impressive. Now, you notice Zakir was saying, it's in John's Gospel that you have all this about Jesus being God. You'll notice I didn't use John's Gospel. I used Mark's Gospel deliberately because I expected Zakir to be claiming that was the original one and the other one's exaggerated and exaggerated. That's why I stuck to Mark's Gospel. Okay, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Hussain to reply.
6 minutes.
6 minutes.
Hello once again. So, I don't feel Richard touched on most of my points. Like, most of his opening statements were red herrings. Like, sources for the Quran and historical stuff, that stuff is for tomorrow, it's not for today. It's not possible for me to respond to so many different points in 6 minutes. But I want to talk about some of the things that he brought up in his opening statement. Like, for example, he says, Jesus forgave sins. Is that supposed to prove he's God? Because the Pharisees got angry. But what about Matthew chapter 9, where it quotes the people who said, how glorious is God that he gave man such authority? As James Dunn points out in his book, Parting of the Ways, the reason the Pharisees were angry is they were thinking, on what authority is he telling him that his sins are forgiven? He's not part of the temple cult. So it wasn't that he was claiming to be God. So if Jesus telling somebody that his sins are forgiven makes him God, then I'd like Richard to tell us if the disciples are God. Because in John chapter 20, the disciples can also forgive sins. He also said that the high priest yelled blasphemy because Jesus said that I am and Daniel's clouds on the heaven. But the point is, if you go to Luke's gospel and you go to other manuscripts of Mark, what Jesus actually said is, you say that I am. And when he quoted Daniel's prophecy, that doesn't mean that the person in Daniel is God, because it says that person was given dominion. God cannot be given dominion. And even Jews who interpreted Daniel's prophecy never understood it as being somebody who's actually God. The word worship for the person is son of man is also used for David's wife who worshipped, in inverted commas, David. And David Klinghoffer in his book, Why the Jews Reject Jesus, also mentioned that the word for worship there can also be used to pay homage to another man. And Dr. Michael L. Brown, in his book, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, he's a Christian scholar, admits that that's the case. So Daniel chapter 7 doesn't prove that Jesus is God. And moreover, you quoting that text actually refutes that Jesus is God, because that text is a false prophecy. Jesus said to the high priest, you shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. But that high priest died 2,000 years ago, and Jesus never came in the clouds of heaven. So can you explain that false prophecy, please, Richard? Then he said, there's something special about Jesus. He calls God Father. But all Jews call God Father. Malachi called God Father. Isaiah called God Father. Deuteronomy calls God Father. That don't make Jesus special. He also said that he first claimed that Jesus' followers wrote the New Testament. But then I've showed biblical scholars who confirmed that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. They actually changed the image of Jesus. Did eyewitnesses need to go to Mark, who's not an eyewitness, and copy from him? No. So you haven't proven that the New Testament's from eyewitnesses. Paul was an eyewitness. So you're just saying things about Jesus, what other people said, but I quoted you Jesus. Then he said there were no controversy with the church fathers. Yeah, there were disputes between Muslims regarding Tawheed, but nowhere on the level of who Jesus was. Some church fathers believe Jesus had a beginning. Some of them believe that Origen, for example, one of the greatest church fathers, believed Jesus was subordinate to the Father. So it took 4 centuries for the Nicene Creed to become official. He also said that there's no evidence that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba. I can quote the Talmud and a lot of non-Islamic sources to show that, but I will issue a challenge to you. Can you give me a non-biblical source that shows that dead people rose up in Jerusalem and started walking around like Matthew claims? Can you show me one source, please? Give me one historian, Josephus, or anyone from the 1st century who heard anybody say that dead people rose up when Jesus allegedly got crucified and walked into Jerusalem. If you can't show me a source, you've refuted your own argument, and that's inconsistency. He says the Quran got mixed up regarding the sister of Aaron. But in the Quranic language, when somebody is from the tribe of someone, they can be called the brother or sister of that person. So we believe that Mary was from the tribe of Levi, which 2nd century Christian sources confirm. So the earliest biographies we got of Mary claim she was from Levi, not from Judah. So we believe that she was called sister of Aaron in the sense of being from the tribe of Aaron. But if that's an error for the Quran, what are you going to do about, I believe it's Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus claimed the Jews killed Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, between the altar. But if you go to the Old Testament, it wasn't Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, who died near the altar. It was Zechariah, the son of Jehodiah. So Jesus mixed up the 2 Zechariahs. I'd like you to respond to that, please. He says, Deuteronomy can't refer to Muhammad because the word countrymen means fellow Israelite. Actually, Genesis chapter 16 explicitly calls Ishmael the brethren of his brothers, which is Isaac and the other sons of Ishmael, of Abraham. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, the Edomites, who are Arabs, are called the brethren of the Israelites. So you have a contradiction there. Then if you claim Deuteronomy 18 is talking about a fellow Israelite, then Deuteronomy chapter 34 denies that a prophet in Israel can be like Moses. This is why the Jewish Study Bible claims there's a contradiction in this text. The only explanation is brethren refers to an Arab, not to a fellow Israelite. He says that Muslims have been combing the Old Testament for prophecies of Muhammad. Who said that we need to go to the Greek of John to find Muhammad's name? The Syriac, which many of the many of the Eastern Christians from the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, they read their New Testament in Syriac, and the word Munahma is the Syriac form of the Arabic Ahmad, which is a superlative form of Muhammad. So we can find him by name. But now I got a challenge for you. Matthew chapter 2, verse 23 claims that the Old Testament has a prophecy that he will be called a Nazarene. I'd like you to show me where this sentence is in the Old Testament, that he will be called a Nazarene. So we'll see how you comb through the Old Testament. Regarding... 6 minutes done. All right, thanks a lot.
Would you like a minute?
No, that's fine.
Thank you. I'd now like to welcome Mr. Lucas to continue.
Well, thank you. I'd like to start just by pointing out again that Zakir isn't giving us reasons why we should accept the Quran's account as reliable, but he's continuing to attack the reliability of the New Testament. As I've said, I think the big picture in this debate is that Zakir believes what he believes because the Quran says it, but he isn't defending it on the basis of convincing us that the Quran is reliable. Instead, he's undermining the New Testament in various ways. Now, Zakir said it wasn't relevant, the fact that I was showing that the Quran has incorporated accounts which we've every reason to think were fictional legends, folklore, that were written centuries after Jesus. If that isn't significant to tonight's debate in terms of the reliability of the Quran as a source of information about Jesus, I really don't know what is. That seems highly relevant to me. Zakir said, no, maybe it wasn't just God who could forgive sins, but look at the response of the priests. That's the way they obviously understood that at the time. With the Son of Man, Zakir tried to equivocate about the term worship that was used. That was part of my argument. But the phrases that were applied to the Son of Man and other parts of Daniel's prophecy are phrases that are applied to God. Zakir said, well, Jesus said, you will see me coming in the clouds. And the high priest didn't see Jesus coming in the clouds. That's Jesus quoting from the passage about the Son of Man to illustrate, to tie it in, to make it clear that it is referring to the Son of Man as spoken about in the prophecy of Daniel. There are other instances of people in the Bible in the Old Testament referring to God as Father, but I said the intimate Abba word was unique to Jesus. Now, Zakir quoted Bart Ehrman, I said a very skeptical scholar in this area. But I'd like to read something that Bart Ehrman wrote quite recently. He said, until a year ago, I would have said, and frequently did say, in the classroom, in public lectures, and in my writings, that Jesus is portrayed as God in the Gospel of John, but not, definitely not, in the other Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I finally yielded. These Gospels do indeed think of Jesus as divine, being made the very Son of God, who can heal, cast out demons, raise the dead, pronounce divine forgiveness, receive worship, together suggest that even for these Gospels, Jesus was a divine being, not a human. So yes, now I agree that Jesus is portrayed as a divine being, a God-man, in all of the Gospels. If you look at the statistics through the Gospels, of the number of times Jesus is called the Son of Man, the Son of God, it's multiple occasions in all of the Gospels. I think the thesis that this develops slowly, it's only really there in John, it's not really there in Mark, just doesn't hold water at all. Now, I was fascinated, I think I heard this right, I think Zakir said that I'm quoting second-hand reports about Jesus, and I think Zakir said that he was quoting from Jesus directly. I'd be fascinated to hear Zakir expanding on that, as to where his more direct sources than Jesus' friends and followers writing their eyewitnesses' accounts are. Now, Zakir said that the sources about Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba, etc. The fact that that's what I'm saying about sources. Lots of stories were made up in the intervening years between the New Testament or between the Old Testament and the Quran. A lot of them are incorporated in the Quran. It's not that there's not sources, it's that there's not reliable sources with any sort of historical credibility. Now, Zakir explained about Mary being the sister of Aaron. All I can say to you is, to me, that sounded quite contrived, the way he was trying to avoid the conclusion there. I mean, why would Allah reveal it saying, Mary, sister of Aaron, if it was Muslims for centuries from then on were going to have this difficult job explaining exactly what that meant? Right, thank you.